So today I'm going to give you my biggest tips for fingering bebop on the guitar. Hi everybody, welcome to Jazz Guitar Scrapbook. Please feel free to like and subscribe and validate this nonsense. Now, as this music was created by people who play this type of instrument, traditionally I think guitarists think it's not guitaristic music. I think it's not that bad, but I think you do have to approach the instrument slightly differently than if you were playing more guitar music, even jazz guitar based music. First thing, I find it's much better to at least partially and maybe fully learn these things by ear. So that might be a bit scary, but we have lots of software now that can help you with that, such as Transcribe, which can slow everything down. You can even slow things down on YouTube. The problem with getting the music from a book like that is that if it's in notation, I tend to play much more positionally in notation than I do if I'm listening to something and playing it by ear. And I find that I don't hear the music in the same way. So for instance, if I hear something as a chord tone or the way it's being slurred into the chord tone or whatever, I'll talk about that a little bit later, it's much harder to hear when you're reading it, I think, than if you're listening to the record. So I find that helps a lot. As you get more experience, you'll be able to recognize those things. But I would definitely recommend listening. Now, I know that that's probably intimidating for a lot of people. Totally understand. Best to start simple. There's a few 8-bar bebop heads out there like Yardbird Suite and Scrapple from the Apple, by which I mean there's an A section which repeats, and then the B section you don't have to learn it. It's kind of a solo B section. So at least you're sort of aiming to learn a limited amount of information. It's not too scary. Groovin' High is a good one as well, so it has the same lick that gets transposed around the place a lot. So that's a great one for guitarists. Also, 12-bar blues, very good, not too long. And try and look at those things before going into the more through-composed tunes like, Hot House, Confirmation, Donnelly, stuff like that, which has got a lot more notes. One thing I think that makes it hard is that on the guitar we tend to learn everything in positions, which is fine. But the thing is that even if I take, like this very traditional G major scale position there, just by doing that I've gone 2 octaves, right? There's no bebop heads, at least not written by Charlie Parker, that have more than like an octave and a half, really. The sort of alto saxophone range is kind of up here somewhere, and that's the tenor saxophone range. There's not really any scales that are longer than an octave. So Donnelly, for instance, just 1 octave, well, less than 1 octave, actually. So I definitely recommend practicing your scale shapes, whether you use 4 fingers like that or 3 fingers. Just practice them in 1 octave shapes. Yeah. That'll teach you the neck really well in little bits that you can join together. Do the same with arpeggios. And I found that I had to do that to be able to participate in Barry Harris's improvisation class. I couldn't do it because I was tied to these cumbersome fingerings. The 3 notes of string thing is even more cumbersome. Is it 2 octaves and a half there? These little positions are much easier to use for playing jazz. It's a really big hint. I just found that through getting roasted at Barry Harris's workshops and not being able to play any of it. And then when I came back, when I worked on that, I was able to play it. And I definitely recommend that. Another important exercise, really concentrate on where the chord tones are in isolation to anything else. I'm using 1 finger there to trace all the notes of B flat major. Do it along 1 string if you want. It's really important to know where all the notes are so that when you think B flat major, the notes of the triad just light up. Also, these triad shapes can be helpful. You probably know those anyway. A surprising number of people don't know those. So there's not that many to learn. There's for the close position ones, there's 4 string groups, and each one has only 3 chord shapes. For instance, this one. Then it repeats. So that's only 12 shapes you have to learn for major, right? It's not that hard. I think it's quite important that you do that work, though. This means that you're able to access things like enclosures and neighbour tones and things a lot easier without having to be stuck in position and thinking like, oh, what's the scale? Which I think is a big problem for guitarists. A technical challenge of playing things like bebop heads is often we're having that annoying thing when the note's on the same fret but on different strings. A couple of technical problems with that. First thing is obviously, do we play this with the same finger? I would say not. I think that approach is great when you've got to play an arpeggio really fast. But for the kind of moderate speeds we're dealing with in bebop, you know, in rock guitar talk, that'd be 120 beats a minute, 130, something like that. In jazz, 240, 260 in eighth notes. It's not super fast, but it is challenging to get that clean and even all the time. And if you go and listen to someone like Adam Rogers, he is very extraordinarily clean and even. So that's the challenge. So you might be able to do that like that. For me, I found that it's easier to use separate fingers, just to get that. Just to have that control, really. So I like to do it that way. So for anthropology, I play it like that. A segment, or, I find that really helps me. Now, one other challenge is that you might tend to rush as you go across the strings. So make sure that you play that in time. This is not just a right hand problem, by the way, although I like alternate picking, things like that. Also, downstroke only is good if you can manage it. That's how Charlie Christian did it. Also, make sure this fingering is going in time as well with your fretting hand. Now, obviously you can't do that if you're just using one finger for two notes. So that's part of the reason why I prefer to practice that way. Enclosures, neighbour tones, things like that. Right. So neighbour tones usually a half step below and a diatonic step above. Okay? Not always, but usually. So if I'm doing the lower neighbours, I would then be thinking about, for instance, in B flat, my fingering's all over the neck, and I'll be playing with two fingers like that. Although, hopefully in the right key. Okay? A bit like maybe the way Django did it, And I find that really helps. And if I'm incorporating the upper neighbour as well into an enclosure figure, maybe something like this. That's upper neighbour, chord tone, lower neighbour, chord tone. So it's a 4-note figure. Okay? So in minor. So obviously this goes back a way. This is a very traditional way of embellishing chord tones. It's good to become conversant with that. It does pop up a lot in bop. An obvious, very simple enclosure figure is here. In anthropology. A lower neighbour tone in scrapple. But the point is that I'm always trying to get these figures on the same string. So here's one from Hot House. Yeah. These things come up a lot. So a lot of people get a bit worried about how to finger chromaticism. What we call bop scales, random note scales, have a lot of chromaticism in them, as well as just like purely chromatic lines. One very simple thing that comes up a lot is when we link this in A flat, the third of a chord up to the fifth. Don't feel like you have to do it like that. It's fine. And think about the timing. And 1 and 2. So if we slur into the beat, it often swings. So we slow the last note. That's an idea that comes from saxophone tonguing, right? Same thing with this Donna Lee line. Now, of course, you can pick every note, but it's quite nice to have the slur in there. And also, it informs the way you might finger that phrase. A really nice example is one from Hot House, where we've got this chromatic scale going down. Okay. The important thing is to think about where the beats are coming up. So 1, 2, and 3. So I like to slur that one because it's on the beat. I like to slur that one as well. See how it turns into a really practical three-note, three fingers fingering. So I think in the end these things should be as accessible as blues licks. They should have the same kind of vibe rather than going like, oh, I'm going to play something terribly clever now. You know. They should have a bit of grit to them, and I find the three fingers thing helps with that. Anyway, I've got a video if you want to watch it. And then the same thing for just pure chromatic lines. So there's one from Donna Lee which goes down to the sharp 11th, B flat, and it's in triplets. Okay. So how do we do that? Well, let's say, again, it's good to notice where we are on the beat. So it's 1 and a 2, yep. So you can start the last one because it's on the beat. I usually play in this octave actually when I'm playing Donna Lee. So, and actually end up, I quite like to split it up as we go across the string, which works all right phrasing wise, I think. You can also play it like this, which is a little bit less practical, right? So that's why I do that. I'm paying attention to where which ones because it's like the neighbour tones again, these are lower neighbour tones. Yeah? So that affects the way I phrase a chromatic scale. I call all this stuff harmonic fingering. You're thinking about the chords and how what you're playing is relating to the harmony, and that affects your fingering decisions. The last thing, twiddles. So twiddles are legato, hammer-ons and pull-offs, and they go along the string. Really good example from Hot House again. There's a lot of twiddles in bebop, you know, like oh, good day. Yeah. These are all handled as you would handle any little legato hammer-on and pull-off phrase, and therefore they should be along the string, in my opinion, as much as possible. There's a blues line in Confirmation. But you'll notice that like even Wes Montgomery and Grant Green and other mostly three-fingered players will use these kind of little filigrees. Or Pat Metheny. Just a thing that's very natural to the guitar, and it's quite easy and simple to do. But be on the lookout for the filigrees in the heads. These are often difficult to see in things like the Omnibook, but if you listen to the records closely, you'll be able to pick them out.